The house on Ash Lane was perfect, at least, that's what Alice told herself. It wasn't too big or too small, just enough space for her and her loyal golden retriever, Max. The white siding gleamed under the afternoon sun, and the porch swing creaked gently in the breeze. Surrounded by a garden overgrown with wildflowers and an ancient apple tree in the back, it had a charm that instantly drew her in. It felt like the beginning she needed after her divorce. The price had been shockingly low, but Alice wasn't one to question a good deal. The realtor had mentioned something vague about the property being on the market for a long time, but Alice assumed it was due to the town's remoteness. Nestled deep in Idaho, the little community of Ridgewood was quiet, almost too quiet. She'd chosen it for its seclusion, eager to leave the chaos of her old life behind. Unpacking her boxes in the empty living room, Alice felt a wave of relief. Here, no one knew her. There were no pitying glances from neighbors or probing questions from friends. This was her fresh start. As the sun dipped lower, Alice took Max for a walk around the neighborhood. Ridgewood was picturesque, with tree-lined streets and tidy yards. The locals she passed greeted her with polite smiles, but their friendliness felt restrained. An older woman raking leaves across the street hesitated when Alice mentioned moving into the house on Ash Lane. "That old place?" the woman asked, her voice tight. "Well, welcome to Ridgewood." She didn't say anything else, quickly retreating into her home. Alice shrugged off the encounter, blaming small-town quirks. By the time she returned, dusk had settled over the town, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. The house looked even more inviting in the soft glow of the porch light. That night, as Alice lay in bed, she found it hard to sleep. The house was old, and it groaned and creaked like an aging ship. Max seemed restless, too, his ears twitching at every noise. "Relax, buddy," Alice muttered, reaching down to pat his head. But just as she began to drift off, a soft sound reached her ears, a faint scratching, like nails against wood. She sat up, her heart pounding. Max growled low, his body tense. "Probably a raccoon," Alice whispered, trying to convince herself. Still, unease coiled in her chest as she stared into the darkened hallway. The scratching stopped, and the house fell silent again. Alice forced herself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Something about the house felt off. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains in Alice's bedroom, banishing the shadows that had unsettled her the night before. She laughed at herself as she poured a steaming cup of coffee. "Just an old house settling," she muttered, shaking off the remnants of unease. Max, on the other hand, seemed less convinced. He sat stiffly by the front door, his eyes fixed on the dark hallway leading to the back of the house. "Come on, Max," Alice said, snapping her fingers to get his attention. "You're acting weird." She set his food bowl down, but he barely touched it, his gaze still locked on the hallway. After breakfast, Alice decided to keep herself busy. She unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and hung up a few pictures on the walls. The house slowly started to feel like hers. By midday, she was feeling productive and proud. But the strange noises started again. This time, it wasn't scratching, it was faint whispers, barely audible, like distant voices carried by the wind. Alice paused mid-step, holding her breath. The sound seemed to be coming from upstairs. Her heart raced as she climbed the creaking staircase. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing off the bare walls. Silence greeted her. She checked every room, finding nothing out of place. But as she turned to leave her bedroom, she noticed something odd. The mirror on the dresser was fogged up, as though someone had breathed on it. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool glass, and froze. A faint handprint was etched into the condensation, too small to be hers. Alice's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away. She tripped over Max, who had followed her upstairs. He barked sharply, his hackles raised. Grabbing her phone, Alice called her closest neighbor, a man named Tom who had introduced himself briefly when she moved in. "Hi, Tom. It's Alice, from Ash Lane," she said, trying to steady her voice. "This is going to sound ridiculous, but, have you ever heard anything strange about my house?" There was a long pause. When Tom finally spoke, his tone was cautious. "Why do you ask?" I think someone might have broken in," she lied. "I wouldn't jump to conclusions," Tom replied, his voice uneasy. "That house, it's been empty for years. Maybe it just takes some getting used to." "Years?" Alice asked, frowning. "The realtor told me it was vacant for 6 months." Tom sighed. "They don't always tell you everything. Look, if you need anything, just call. But, maybe keep your doors locked." The line went dead before Alice could ask more. For the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her. As night fell, the whispers returned, louder this time, slipping through the walls like an unwelcome guest. And in the stillness, Alice swore she heard her name. The following morning, Alice woke up to Max growling softly at the bedroom door. His ears were pinned back, his eyes fixed on the hallway. Alice hesitated, the events of the previous night fresh in her mind. Forcing herself out of bed, she grabbed her robe and opened the door cautiously. The hallway was empty, bathed in pale morning light. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. Shaking her head, she muttered, "You're letting this place get to you." After feeding Max, Alice decided to distract herself by running errands in town. She stopped at the local coffee shop, a cozy place with a few regulars chatting quietly. The barista, a friendly young woman named Claire, greeted her warmly. "Getting settled in?" Claire asked, handing Alice her latte. "Trying to," Alice replied. "My house is interesting. Feels like it has a lot of history." Claire's smile faltered. "Oh. You're on Ash Lane, right?" Alice raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, why?" Claire glanced around as if checking who might be listening. Lowering her voice, she said, "I'm not trying to scare you, but that house has a bit of a reputation. People around here call it the widow's house." "Widow's house?" Alice repeated, her curiosity piqued. Claire hesitated before continuing. "The last person who lived there was a woman named Martha Caldwell. She moved in with her husband about 20 years ago. He died in a car accident not long after they settled in. People say she went a little strange after that." "What do you mean, strange?" "She became a recluse. Barely left the house, stopped talking to anyone. Then, about 5 years ago, she just disappeared. No one knows what happened to her." Alice felt a chill run down her spine. "Disappeared?" Claire nodded. "The police searched, but there was no sign of her. No evidence of foul play, either. It's like she just vanished." Alice tried to brush it off as small-town gossip, but the unease in Claire's voice lingered with her. On her way out of the cafe, she stopped by the local library. The librarian, an elderly man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, directed her to the archives. After an hour of searching, she found an article about Martha Caldwell. The headline read, "Local Woman Missing, NO Leads in ASH Lane Mystery." The article described Martha's sudden disappearance, but what caught Alice's attention was the mention of strange complaints from neighbors, sounds of footsteps, whispers, and even shadows seen moving through the house long after Martha was gone. Alice shut the file, her hands trembling. She had wanted a fresh start, but it seemed she'd walked straight into someone else's nightmare. That evening, as she returned home, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't faint. They seemed closer, louder. And as Alice stood frozen in the hallway, she realized they were coming from the basement. The whispers stopped the moment Alice reached the basement door. She stood there, her hand hovering over the doorknob, heart pounding in her chest. Max stood beside her, growling low and steady, his tail tucked between his legs. The door was locked, just as it had been since she moved in. She hadn't thought much of it before. It wasn't unusual for older homes to have forgotten keys or sealed-off areas. But now, standing in the eerie silence, the locked door felt like a barrier to something far more sinister. Taking a deep breath, Alice pulled herself away and turned on every light in the house. She tried to focus on mundane tasks, sorting through boxes, organizing the kitchen, but her mind kept drifting back to the whispers and the locked basement. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified in the darkness. Around midnight, Alice was jolted awake by a loud bang. Max was already on his feet, barking furiously. Alice grabbed her phone and crept toward the sound, which seemed to have come from the living room. The sight that greeted her made her stomach drop. The front door, which she had locked and bolted, was wide open. Cold air blew into the room, and a faint trail of muddy footprints led from the doorway to the hallway. "Who's there?" Alice called, her voice trembling. No answer. She hurried to close and lock the door again, double-checking the bolt this time. Max sniffed the footprints, growling as he followed them down the hall. The trail stopped abruptly near the basement door, where the air felt colder than the rest of the house. Alice backed away, her mind racing. Had someone broken in? But how? She had checked all the windows earlier, and they were still locked. The thought of calling the police crossed her mind, but what would she tell them? That her door opened by itself? That she was hearing whispers? It sounded ridiculous, even to her. Instead, she spent the rest of the night in the living room with Max by her side, the lights on and a heavy flashlight clutched in her hand. When morning came, Alice decided to install security cameras. By afternoon, she had set up one facing the front door and another in the hallway near the basement. That evening, she checked the footage from the previous night. Her stomach churned as she watched the door swing open on its own, the muddy footprints materializing out of thin air. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the hallway, just for a moment, before vanishing. Alice's blood ran cold. She wasn't imagining things. Someone, or something, was in her house. Alice couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure from the footage. She replayed it over and over, hoping for a rational explanation. The video didn't lie, the figure had been there, lingering in the hallway, before vanishing like smoke. By midday, her nerves were frayed. The house felt suffocating, every creak of the floorboard sending shivers down her spine. Max seemed equally on edge, pacing near the front door and whining softly. Deciding she needed fresh air, Alice grabbed a jacket and stepped into the backyard. The cool autumn breeze did little to calm her, but the garden's serenity was a welcome distraction. She wandered toward the apple tree, its gnarled branches heavy with fruit. The tree was beautiful in its way, but there was something unsettling about it. The bark was scarred with deep gouges, almost as if someone, or something, had clawed at it. "Just an old tree," Alice muttered, brushing her fingers against the rough bark. Max darted past her suddenly, barking at the far edge of the yard where the tall grass swayed in the wind. His hackles rose as he let out a series of sharp, frantic barks. "Max, stop!" Alice called, but he wouldn't listen. She followed him, her heart pounding as she approached the edge of the property. The grass was trampled in patches, as though someone had been there recently. Alice scanned the area, but it was empty. Then she saw it, just for a second, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Alice took a hesitant step forward, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the area, but the yard was still. She grabbed Max by the collar and hurried back into the house, bolting the door behind her. Her heart raced as she leaned against the door, her mind spinning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. By nightfall, Alice was too afraid to turn off the lights. She sat in the living room, Max curled up beside her, her eyes darting to the security monitor every few minutes. Around midnight, the camera in the backyard flickered. Alice stared at the screen, her stomach twisting in knots. The grainy image cleared just enough to reveal movement near the apple tree. A shadow stood there, barely illuminated by the porch light. It didn't move, didn't shift, it simply stood, staring at the house. Alice clutched Max tightly, her breath shallow. She wanted to believe it was her imagination, but deep down, she knew the truth. The shadow wasn't going anywhere. It was waiting. Alice couldn't bring herself to leave the living room that night. The shadow by the apple tree had terrified her, and the haunting whispers seemed to follow her everywhere. She had checked the security footage again and again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was a logical explanation, perhaps a branch swaying in the wind or a trick of the light. But no. The figure had been there, clear as day, standing motionless, watching the house. As dawn broke the following morning, Alice was exhausted, both mentally and physically. Max, too, seemed drained, not even bothering to eat his breakfast. She knew she needed to do something about this, something that would put her mind at ease, or at the very least, help her understand what was happening in this house. It was time to learn more about Martha Caldwell. After dropping Max off at the local vet for a checkup, Alice made her way to Ridgewood's small-town library. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Dobbins, was behind the counter as Alice entered. Mrs. Dobbins looked up over her glasses, and her expression shifted from neutral to guarded when she saw Alice. "You're the one who moved into that house, aren't you?" Mrs. Dobbins asked, her voice low, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. Alice nodded, feeling a pit form in her stomach. "I'm looking for more information on Martha Caldwell. I think she might have had something to do with what's happening in my house." Mrs. Dobbins paused, eyes flicking to the shelves behind her as if searching for the right words. After a long moment, she said, "You're not the first to come asking about that house, you know. People around here don't like to talk about it, but I suppose you deserve to know the truth." She led Alice to a small section of the library, filled with dusty local history books and old newspapers. Martha Caldwell was troubled. After her husband died, she became increasingly withdrawn. Neighbors said she began talking to herself and leaving strange messages on her doorstep, things about death, and spirits, and things from the other side. They all thought she was grieving, but I don't know, there was always something odd about her. Alice frowned. "What do you mean, odd?" Mrs. Dobbins lowered her voice further, glancing over her shoulder. "She started performing rituals in the house. Nothing overt, but people could hear strange noises at night, scraping, chanting, things that made them uncomfortable. And then one day, she simply disappeared." "Disappeared?" Alice asked, her voice shaky. "Did anyone ever find out what happened to her?" Mrs. Dobbins shook her head. "Not a thing. The police searched for months, but she was gone. Some folks say she left willingly. Others, they say she was taken. That the spirits she had been talking to came for her." Alice swallowed hard. "What do you mean by taken?" Mrs. Dobbins hesitated, her eyes darkening. "You're asking questions that shouldn't be asked, dear. You'd best be careful. That house has a way of getting into people's heads. I've heard enough stories to know that once you start digging into its history, you don't always get to walk away." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since moving in, Alice felt the weight of something far worse than mere fear pressing down on her. When she returned home, she felt different. The house seemed even colder than before. She checked the security cameras, hoping to find some comfort in the footage, but all she saw was the same eerie emptiness, until the very last clip. In the corner of the frame, by the apple tree, the figure was there again. But this time, it wasn't just standing. It was moving closer to the house. And in the low light, Alice could see its face, pale, hollow, with eyes that gleamed like black pits, staring directly at the camera. It was Martha. Alice's breath caught in her throat as the figure vanished from the screen, but she could still feel its presence, creeping through the walls of the house. The whispers started again, louder this time, as if they were calling her name. Alice sat frozen in front of the security monitor, her hand trembling as she stared at the blank screen. The figure, Martha Caldwell, had been right there, in her backyard, staring directly at the camera with hollow eyes. Her heart thudded in her chest as she tried to rationalize what she had seen. It wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But deep down, Alice knew the truth. Something was happening in this house, something far beyond anything she could explain. Max, who had been quietly watching her, suddenly perked up. His ears were forward, eyes fixed on the door. He growled low, the fur on his back standing on end. Alice's breath hitched. Before she could move, the front door creaked open. The cold air rushed in, sending a chill down her spine. Max barked furiously, but Alice couldn't move. It was as if her body had been frozen by the terror that gripped her. The door was supposed to be locked. She had checked it. But now, it was open. And something was standing on the other side. Alice slowly got up, her legs shaky, as she crept toward the door. She reached out with a trembling hand to close it, but just as her fingers brushed the handle, she heard something behind her, a faint whisper. Alice. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But the hallway was empty. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she backed away from the door. The whisper came again. Alice. This time, it was louder, clearer, and Alice knew with sickening certainty that it was coming from behind her. Turning slowly, she saw something she couldn't believe, something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, a figure stood. Martha Caldwell, her face pale and expressionless, stood just behind Alice. Her eyes were black, hollow voids, staring right at Alice as if she could see her soul. Alice opened her mouth to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but Alice could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. And then, in the reflection, Martha smiled. A slow, unsettling smile. Max barked louder, his growl turning into frantic howls as he lunged toward the door. Alice turned to face him, desperate to break free from the paralyzing fear, but when she looked back at the mirror, Martha was gone. But the house had changed. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick and heavy. The once comfortable surroundings now felt alien, like she was in a place she didn't belong. Alice's breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to steady herself. She needed to leave. She grabbed her jacket and rushed to the door, but when she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in her chest as she pulled harder, but the door remained locked from the outside. Suddenly, a voice, cold and rasping, whispered in her ear. "You can't leave, Alice." She spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper echoed in her mind, leaving her trembling, her heart pounding with primal fear. She was trapped. Desperately, Alice grabbed her phone, dialing 911. The operator's voice on the other end was calm, but the words felt distant, as though they were coming from another world. 911, what's your emergency? I need help. Alice choked out. I'm being watched. There's something in my house. Stay calm, ma'am, the operator replied. Where are you? I'm at 128, Ash Lane. Please, hurry. Alice's voice was frantic, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The line went dead. She tried calling again, but there was no signal. Her phone flashed a low battery warning before it powered down completely. The house was silent now, the whispers gone. But the feeling of being watched, that remained. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, swirling around her as if they were alive. The air grew colder, heavier, until Alice could barely keep her footing. She needed to get out of the house, she needed to escape, but the door remained locked, and the windows were sealed tight. The walls began to close in, the once spacious rooms now feeling like a prison. And then, from the corner of her eye, Alice saw it again. The shadow. It was standing in the doorway, just out of reach, watching her with those hollow eyes. Alice. It was Martha's voice again. And this time, Alice knew she was no longer alone. Alice's mind raced, her thoughts spinning in a frantic frenzy as the shadow in the doorway loomed closer. Her body trembled uncontrollably, as if every cell in her being screamed for her to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor. The air around her thickened, heavy with an oppressive coldness that made it hard to breathe. Max, once her loyal companion, now cowered in the corner of the living room, his tail between his legs, his eyes wide with terror. He whimpered softly, as if sensing the overwhelming malevolence that filled the house. Alice. The voice came again, clear and rasping, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It felt like a command. A summons. She forced herself to move, slowly, deliberately, her steps echoing in the silence of the house. Her hand reached for the door handle again, but no matter how hard she twisted and turned it, the door remained locked. The cold, clammy sensation of panic gripped her chest. She couldn't stay here, couldn't be trapped with whatever was in the house with her. "Why are you doing this?" Alice shouted into the emptiness, her voice trembling. There was no immediate response, but the shadow in the doorway slowly shifted. The air grew heavier still, as though the very walls were breathing, suffocating her in their oppressive embrace. And then, she saw it. The figure that had been haunting her all this time, standing in full form at the doorway. Martha Caldwell, but not as Alice had remembered her. Her body was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched too tightly over her bones. Her eyes were no longer just hollow, they were black pits, sucking in the light and leaving nothing but a void. And her smile, it was twisted, cruel, almost mocking. "Alice," Martha said again, her voice now a low, echoing rasp that seemed to reverberate off the walls, "You're here to join me." Alice stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but her legs felt weak, her breath shallow and uneven. "Join you? What do you want from me?" Alice gasped, her mind racing to understand what was happening. Martha's grin widened impossibly, and she stepped forward, the space between them closing with unnatural speed. The air thickened as if the very room was shrinking. "You're the final one," Martha said, her voice now a guttural growl. "The offering. The one who completes the circle." Alice's blood turned to ice as she backed into the wall, her mind unable to fully comprehend what was unfolding. Her body was rooted in place, trapped between the walls of her own home and the ancient, malevolent presence that stood before her. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her, filling her ears with a chorus of voices. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her temples, trying to block out the madness that was consuming her. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This can't be real." Martha's eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. "Oh, but it is, Alice. You're not leaving this place. You never were." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The walls of the house seemed to bend, warping in and out of focus, and Alice felt herself falling, her body dragged down by an invisible force. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the oppressive darkness that closed in around her. The last thing Alice saw before everything went black was Martha's face, her smile stretched wide in victory. "Alice, welcome home." When Alice woke, it was in darkness. The air was thick and damp, and her head felt heavy, as if she had been asleep for far too long. She slowly lifted her hand to her face, finding it cold and clammy. Her breath came out in shallow gasps as she tried to orient herself. She was no longer in her house. The ground beneath her felt strange, uneven, and damp, as though she were lying on the cold earth. Her surroundings were pitch black, the only sounds the distant rustle of leaves and a faint murmur of voices. Forcing herself to sit up, Alice's eyes strained to adjust to the darkness. She could make out the shape of trees looming above her, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Then, she heard it, the same raspy voice she had been hearing in the house. "Alice." She turned her head sharply, her pulse racing. But there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness and the quiet whispers swirling around her. Her eyes widened as a horrible realization gripped her heart. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. She was in the woods. In the very place where Martha Caldwell had disappeared all those years ago. And Alice knew, without a doubt, that she would never leave. The cold earth beneath Alice was unforgiving, and she could feel every chill seep into her skin, paralyzing her with fear. She could barely hear her own breath over the low, haunting whispers that seemed to echo through the trees. Her surroundings felt unreal, like a nightmare made manifest. She could make out no more than a few feet ahead, just the dark, twisted shapes of trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Her body trembled as the full weight of her situation began to sink in. She had been dragged here, to some place far removed from the familiar world she had known. But she wasn't alone. "Alice." The voice came again, unmistakable. The same voice that had taunted her in her house. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned around, desperate to find the source of the voice. It was then that she saw it. A faint, eerie light flickered ahead, casting shadows that danced across the forest floor. As she moved toward it, her every step seemed to make the whispers grow louder, until they were a deafening chorus in her ears. The very trees seemed to lean in, their branches stretching toward her, like grasping hands. The light led her to a clearing, and there, standing in the center, was Martha. But she was no longer the gaunt, skeletal figure Alice had seen in the house. No, here, she was whole, alive, almost too perfect. Her skin was unmarked, her eyes an unnatural shade of black, gleaming with malice. "Alice," Martha purred, her voice dripping with dark satisfaction. "You have arrived." Alice took a shaky step backward, her body filled with dread as she realized what was happening. "What is this? What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. Martha's lips curled into a wicked smile. "I want what you've come to offer, Alice. You, the final piece. You are the one who will make the ritual complete." Alice recoiled in horror. The whispers around her intensified, as if they were rising from the very earth beneath her feet. "Ritual?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean by a ritual?" Martha's eyes glinted in the darkness. "Don't you see? You've been marked from the moment you stepped into that house. It was never a coincidence, Alice. You were chosen." Alice's mind reeled, the weight of Martha's words crashing down on her. The house, the whispers, the shadow at the window, it had all been leading to this. She had been drawn here, not by chance, but by design. Martha stepped closer, her presence oppressive, suffocating. "You're the offering, Alice. The one who will tie the living to the dead. The one who will complete the circle and allow us to cross over fully." "No," Alice gasped, her throat closing in panic. She turned to run, but her legs felt as if they were made of lead. She stumbled, unable to break free from the nightmare that held her in its grip. Martha's voice followed her, smooth and mocking. "You can't run, Alice. The ritual has already begun." Alice's breath quickened, her mind swimming with desperate thoughts of escape. She knew that there was no way out of this place, no way to undo what had been set in motion. The weight of the shadows that surrounded her was too great. She could feel the pull of something darker, something ancient, drawing her in. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the trees groaned as if they were alive. The light flickering ahead grew stronger, pulsating with an eerie energy that seemed to reach out to her, pulling her deeper into the clearing. In the center of the light, a circle had appeared, etched into the earth. It was old, ancient, covered in symbols Alice didn't recognize. Martha moved to stand within it, her arms outstretched as if she were drawing power from the very air. "Join us, Alice," Martha said, her voice a low, hypnotic chant. "Become one with us. Complete the cycle." Alice's heart raced as the darkness closed in around her. The whispers seemed to chant in unison, their voices swirling in her mind, drowning out everything else. She tried to move, to fight, but her body was no longer her own. The ritual had already begun. Alice. The voice was everywhere, in the trees, in the air, in the very ground beneath her. The presence of the spirits that had been trapped for so long filled the clearing, pressing in on her from all sides. And then, the earth beneath her cracked. A terrible rumbling noise shook the ground, and Alice felt herself falling, the world spinning out of control. She reached out, her hand brushing the edge of the circle, but it was too late. The ground gave way completely, and Alice plummeted into darkness. When she landed, it was in a cold, empty place. She was no longer in the forest. No longer in her body. She was surrounded by shadows. And they were waiting for her. Alice's senses were overwhelmed by the darkness that surrounded her. She felt weightless, as though the ground had vanished entirely, and yet there was an unnerving heaviness in the air. The oppressive silence hung around her like a shroud, suffocating and still. Her limbs were frozen, as if bound by invisible chains, and her heart raced in her chest, yet there was no sound of its thudding in this empty place. It was as if she had ceased to exist, caught in a void between life and death. There was no up or down, no direction, no light, just the infinite blackness pressing in from all sides. It felt like being trapped in the deepest part of the ocean, alone, cold, and utterly lost. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, choked off by the silence that seemed to swallow everything. Then, as if pulled by some unseen force, she felt herself being drawn forward. The sensation was not physical, but psychic, as though the very fabric of her consciousness was being tugged along, unwilling and helpless. The darkness around her began to ripple, faint shapes beginning to form in the void, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Alice. The voice. It was Martha's. But it wasn't the voice of the living woman she had known. It was colder, more insistent, almost alien. It filled the void, echoing in her mind, drawing her toward something she couldn't escape. "Alice, do you know where you are?" Martha's voice asked, each word a sharp blade that cut through Alice's panic. The words were not spoken aloud, but reverberated inside her mind, twisting, suffocating. "No," Alice gasped, her mind scrambling to hold on to her thoughts, to understand what was happening. "Where am I?" The shadow of Martha appeared before her, her form shimmering in the darkness like a specter, her once pale face now even more distorted, the blackness of her eyes endless pools that seemed to consume everything in their path. "You are where we all end up, Alice," Martha replied, her grin widening, as if savoring Alice's fear. "In the space between worlds, where the living and the dead are one. Where the souls of the lost are trapped, forever." "No," Alice whispered, her voice hoarse. "This can't be real. I'm not dead." Martha tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with amusement. "You are not alive either. You were never meant to survive this place, Alice. You are nothing but a vessel, a stepping stone in the ritual that has already begun. Alice recoiled as the words sank in. She tried to push past the realization, but it clung to her like a weight, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She tried to focus, to find a way out, but there was no escape from the shadowy landscape. The void was infinite, and she was insignificant, a mere whisper in the endless dark. Alice, Martha's voice was now a soft, almost tender whisper in her ear. The coldness of it sent a shiver down her spine. You are part of something much bigger now. This place, it is where the souls of the damned are kept, those who have been offered as sacrifices, like you. You will never leave. The word sacrifice hung in the air, wrapping itself around Alice's thoughts. Her mind began to unravel, as the truth of Martha's words gnawed at her, pulling at the very core of her being. But Alice refused to give in. She was not ready to be consumed by this darkness. She was not ready to become part of this endless void. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Alice forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edges of the blackness that surrounded her. She could feel the pressure of it pushing back against her, but she fought with all her might. I won't stay, Alice muttered through clenched teeth, her voice raw. I won't let you take me. Martha's form flickered in front of her, almost amused, as though Alice's defiance was nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. You don't have a choice, she said softly. You are already ours. You cannot escape what you have become. Alice's eyes burned with determination. She may not know how to leave this place, but she would not accept this fate. She would fight with every part of herself, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. As if in response to her defiance, the shadows around her began to shift, growing restless. The whispers, once distant, now pressed in around her, louder, faster, swirling like a storm. Alice clenched her fists, ignoring the growing sense of dread clawing at her chest. Then, something shifted. A faint light pierced through the darkness, like a crack in the sky. It was small at first, barely visible, but it grew, spreading outward, brighter and warmer. The shadows around her recoiled, their whispers fading as the light pushed them back. Alice, Martha's voice faltered, as if disturbed by the light. You cannot escape. This is your place. This is where you will remain. Alice focused on the light, not allowing herself to look back at the darkness. She reached toward it, her hand trembling, but her resolve strengthening. The light was real, and with it, there was a chance, however small, of escape. She took a step forward, then another, her body shaking, but her spirit unbroken. And with each step, the darkness receded, the whispers fading into silence. Alice, Martha's voice whispered, now far away. You cannot escape. You were meant for this. But Alice kept moving forward, and the light grew brighter. And in that light, she could finally see a path. A way out. The light before Alice grew with each step she took, pulling her in like a beacon, offering her the hope she so desperately needed. Her body was exhausted, every muscle screaming for rest, but her determination surged. The shadows that had once surrounded her, suffocating and all-consuming, seemed to retreat now, their dark forms recoiling from the brilliance ahead. The whispers that had filled her ears with lies and threats faded into nothingness, replaced by a quiet silence that felt almost sacred. As she moved closer to the light, she could feel its warmth on her skin, a stark contrast to the cold, hollow place she had just been trapped in. The sense of dread that had gripped her heart was slowly dissipating, replaced by an unfamiliar feeling, peace. For the first time since she had entered the forest, Alice felt like she was on the brink of something important, something life-changing. But just as she thought she might reach it, a cold voice echoed in the distance. You can't leave, Alice. You belong here. It was Martha's voice, unmistakable and unrelenting. Her words slithered through the air, insistent and sharp, like a claw scraping against the walls of Alice's mind. Alice's pulse quickened, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The light was within reach now, its glow illuminating the path forward, the path to freedom. It was as if the very essence of life was calling to her, urging her to keep going. There was no turning back. "You are nothing without us," Martha's voice continued, growing fainter with each step Alice took. "The ritual is complete. The darkness is yours now." The darkness, Alice thought bitterly. It had always been hers to escape, and it would not claim her now. Not when she had found the light. She wasn't part of this place, this shadowy prison. She wasn't meant to stay. With a final, resolute breath, Alice took one last step into the light. The world around her exploded in brightness, and for a moment, she thought her very soul would be consumed by the intensity of it. But then, as if she were passing through a threshold, the blinding light softened, and Alice found herself standing in a different place altogether. She was outside. The chill of the night air caressed her skin, the scent of pine trees filling her lungs. The oppressive weight of the darkness was gone, replaced by the familiar peace of the forest. She was back in the real world, standing at the edge of the woods she had entered so many days ago, but everything felt different now. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill her chest, grounding her, reminding her she was alive. The moon above shone down on the snow-covered ground, casting long shadows across the landscape. The forest was still, as if nothing had ever happened. But she knew better. She knew that this place would never be the same for her again. She glanced around, half expecting to see Martha's twisted figure lurking in the trees, but there was no sign of her. No shadow, no whisper. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alice was truly alone. But even as the night seemed to calm around her, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind. What if this wasn't the end? What if the darkness had only been waiting for her to let her guard down? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. No. This was it. She had escaped. The ritual had been broken, and she was free. The forest, once dark and suffocating, now seemed open, inviting. The air felt lighter, the moon's glow bathing everything in its soft radiance. Alice could hear the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Life was returning to the world around her. And yet, there was one thing that haunted her, something she couldn't shake. As she turned to walk away, heading back toward the road that would lead her home, she caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was too far away for her to make out clearly, but she could see its outline, tall, impossibly still. A chill ran down Alice's spine, and her breath caught in her throat. Was it Martha? She stopped, unable to look away from the figure. The forest was silent, save for the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. But Alice could feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking. She hesitated for a moment, her instinct telling her to turn around, to run. But instead, she took a step forward. The figure remained unmoving, its shape barely discernible in the dark. Another step, and another. And then, the figure took a step toward her. Alice froze. For a moment, they stood there, separated by the distance of the forest, but it felt as though the space between them was narrowing. The wind shifted, and the figure's shape wavered like a mirage in the moonlight. Then, the figure spoke. Alice. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was Martha. Alice's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she felt the grip of terror once more. But the voice wasn't the same. It was softer now, almost pleading. Come back, Alice. You are meant to join us. You belong here, in the dark. The wind howled through the trees, and Alice spun on her heel, running as fast as her legs could carry her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Not this time. Alice ran through the forest, her breath ragged and her heart hammering against her chest. The sound of her footsteps was muffled by the thick blanket of snow that covered the ground, but the feeling of being pursued was undeniable. Every part of her wanted to stop, to turn around and face whatever horrors waited behind her, but something inside her kept urging her forward. She couldn't stop. Not now. The cold air stung her lungs, but she barely noticed it. The only thing she could focus on was the relentless pounding of her feet on the snow, and the terrifying realization that the dark presence she had escaped was still waiting for her. The figure in the distance, Martha's voice, it all felt so real. Too real. But she couldn't stop. She had to keep running. The trees around her seemed to blur as she sped past them, the familiar path becoming less distinct the further she went. The light of the moon flickered between branches, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Alice's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but nothing fit. The ritual, the dark place, Martha's twisted smile, it all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Then, just as she thought she couldn't go any further, she stumbled into a clearing. The space was quiet, eerily quiet. The cold air stilled around her as she came to a halt, gasping for breath. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and for a brief moment, it felt like the calm before a storm. But the silence held an oppressive weight, one that gnawed at Alice's insides. And then, she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was tall and imposing, but there was something about it that seemed familiar, something she couldn't quite place. The figure was still, watching her. Alice's pulse quickened. She knew this figure. She knew who it was. "Martha," Alice whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Her legs felt weak, but she stood her ground, facing the figure. She wasn't going to let this place swallow her again. She couldn't. The figure took a step forward, and Alice instinctively took a step back. "You can't escape me, Alice," Martha said, her voice a twisted echo of its former self, now cold and hollow. The words wrapped around Alice like a vice, tightening with each syllable. "I'm not part of your world anymore," Alice retorted, her voice more certain than she felt. She had already escaped once, and she couldn't let herself fall into that darkness again. She wouldn't. Martha's smile widened, though her face remained impossibly pale, her eyes darker than they should have been. "You can never leave, Alice. This world, this place, it's yours now. You will always be one of us, whether you accept it or not." Alice shook her head, backing away slowly. She wasn't going to let fear take hold of her again. She had fought too hard to come this far, to escape the grasp of the ritual. But even as she tried to gather her strength, she could feel the darkness closing in around her, pressing at the edges of her mind. "You're wrong," Alice said, her voice growing stronger, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm not part of your world. I'm part of the real world, the world of the living. And I won't let you drag me back." For a moment, Martha seemed to falter. The wicked grin that had spread across her face faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The air around them crackled with tension, the very earth beneath their feet seeming to tremble. "You're stronger than I thought," Martha said, her tone now laced with something almost like admiration. "But it doesn't matter. You're already bound here. And in the end, you'll come back to us. Everyone does." Alice took another step back, but this time, the space between them felt wider. She could feel the weight of the dark presence lifting, not completely, but enough for her to take a breath. "Not this time," Alice said, her voice steady as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the old pendant that had been her grandmother's. She had almost forgotten it was there, but now it felt like the only thing standing between her and the void. The pendant glowed faintly, its light soft but unwavering, cutting through the dark like a beacon. Martha's eyes widened, her smile faltering completely. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice rising in anger. "This," Alice said, holding the pendant out, "is my way out." For a moment, there was silence. The wind stopped, the trees stilled, and even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a force that took Alice completely by surprise, the darkness around her surged forward, as if trying to swallow the light of the pendant whole. The air grew heavy, thick with malice. But Alice held her ground. The pendant began to glow brighter, the light intensifying until it was nearly blinding. The shadows shrieked, retreating, writhing against the glow like creatures of the night fleeing the dawn. Martha's figure flickered, her face contorting with rage. "No!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched, as though it had cracked, losing its strength. "You can't escape." But Alice didn't waver. She clenched the pendant tightly, drawing all the strength she had left into the light that seemed to pulse and throb in her hand. Slowly, the darkness receded, pulled back into the earth where it belonged. The cold grip of fear lifted, and the figure of Martha, once so powerful and malevolent, began to fade, her body dissipating into the air like smoke. And just like that, the nightmare ended. Alice stood alone in the clearing, the glow of the pendant fading into nothingness. The forest around her was quiet again, peaceful. The night was still, the moon casting its soft light on the snow-covered ground. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alice felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She was free. She had won. But as she stood there, taking in the calm of the world around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Something far away, waiting for the right moment to return. But not tonight. Tonight, she was free.